Hey, folks, it's Lindsay with another episode of Leverage Your Podcast Show. And today I get to geek out about tools and processes and automation, and you can't stop me. And I'm chatting here with Joe Casabona, who is a podcast and automation coach with podcast workflows. And we're just going to geek out for 25 minutes, man.
Sounds great, Lindsay. I'm definitely not going to stop you because I'm going to be right there with you. I love talking about this stuff.
Awesome. I know it's kind of like everyone else is like, oh, that's the boring stuff. But for
Mm.
me, I'm like, if it makes you get your podcast done without pain, stress, and cringing, um, it's good in my books.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like kind of like I love baseball and not a lot of people in my immediate orbit now like it. And when I can tell that when I talk about it, their eyes just kind of glaze over. I got to find like the 4 or 5 people who like really love baseball as much as me and talk to them. So
Yes.
I feel like that's what we're doing right here.
Sweet. Awesome. So let's start off with talking about like the problem. Like, why do we suck at it so bad? And why are we not dialing in process for podcasts? Is it because there's so many flipping moving pieces that we're just overwhelmed?
I think it's have you ever had to like change a light bulb in your house or replace the air filter in your HVAC and you're just like, I know I need to do that. I'll do it later. I'll do it later.
Mhm.
I'll do it later. And then you don't do it until it gets so painful, right? So maybe like you don't change the light bulb until the last light bulb in the room goes out and now it's dark and now you actually literally need to change it, right? um we as humans like to put things off until things are painful, and for most people that pain is not recognized
Mm.
until they actually implement it. So it's like a little bit of a chicken of and an egg problem, right? It's like they don't know, and I was like this too. um they don't know they don't know they have the pain until they alleviate it.
Yeah, that is so true. And like from my perspective, I like have a team of like 8 or 9. And it's true. It's like I know I need to change a process because I keep having to fix these things and like whatever. And then you like keep putting it off until like you're ready to pull your hair out and you're like, okay, I
Hmm.
gotta fix it.
Yeah,
Because you
yeah,
do. You just you know it's there.
yeah. And it's and I mean, for me, like the reason that I ultimately did all of this is after I had kids, things got a lot more painful for me as far as trying to get things done and
Yeah.
get work done. And I realized I had to. And so like I started a little bit, but it wasn't until the pandemic I had my first and as far as I remember only panic attack, because my wife's a nurse and I had 2 small kids at the time. And so they're at home and I'm not getting my work done because they're at home and I'm trying to do, and like my wife's like saving lives. So I like didn't really feel like I could complain about that.
Totally.
Um, and I had a panic attack and the straw that broke the camel's back was like my 3-year-old came up to me with like a towel and a bottle of water and was like, "It's okay, daddy." And I'm like, "This is not okay."
Aww.
Yeah. And I'm like, "This is not okay. Like, she shouldn't be taking care of me." And so like right after that, I like buckled down, I automated any process I could, and I hired my first virtual assistant,
Yeah.
so that she does anything I personally don't need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like night and day. And so like I don't want people to experience that
I know,
before
right?
they realize like the payoff of taking all of the stuff off of their plate.
I know. Why do we have to wait until like things are horrible before we fix it? It's insane.
Yeah.
Um, and when you don't have those processes or automations dialed in, like what would you say the consequences are besides your own mental health and
Yeah, yeah.
stress?
Yeah, I suspect most people are not like having a panic attack, right? Um I mean, the biggest thing, right, is how many people listening to this have on, let's say they publish on a Monday, on a Friday they go, "Oh man, I don't have an episode for Monday." What am I
Yippers.
going to do? Right. Um, I don't have a newsletter. I don't have a video, like whatever it is. Right. Um, that is I think the biggest consequence, right, is now um, you are uh, slipping and you're not producing the content you want. If you have sponsors, now you're not um fulfilling your promise to them. And it just kind of snowballs and it becomes more stressful. And at some point, most people will say, well, I haven't been doing it, so I'm going to stop doing it. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's without the right processes, um, you risk getting rid of this potentially helpful thing for your business
Yeah.
uh and for your bottom line.
I know. And we all know consistency and visibility is like absolutely crucial.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. um it's you're showing people that you show up and that you're trustworthy and that you deliver on your
Mm,
promises.
ain't that the truth? I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
Um, and really, if you're like busting your butt on that day before to get it all done, the quality is not going to be there. You're going to cut corners. And I've seen this as well, Joe, is that where I've seen podcasters where like, oh, I've been putting out all my episodes, but I haven't really been great about promoting it. So they
Mm-hmm.
haven't done any reels. They haven't done an email to their list. And so if you're not like you're creating it, but if you're not like leveraging it and getting it out there, then you're not going to be able to grow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think I think this misconception has been debunked at this point, but um the podcast is not the thing that will grow your audience.
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing that will make them know, like, and trust you better. I tell people a podcast is not the first date; it's like the 15th date, right? It's like um, they get introduced to you because of the content you're putting out on social media, and you do that consistently, and then they're like, "Oh, Joe mentioned this podcast, or Lindsay mentioned this podcast. Um, I want to learn more about that," and then they learn more about you. So it's probably like middle of funnel, I guess, if I'm going to put it in like marketing terms. But
Mm,
if you're if you're not even making it to the market, then how are you going to sell your goods, right? So if you're
damn.
if you're not if you're not producing your podcast, then there's no way that you're gonna get people to trust you more.
Yeah. Well said. If that doesn't make people wake up, I don't know what will. Like honestly, it's like, ooh.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the fun stuff here, Joe. So, when you say automations and workflows, like what does that look like and what does that mean?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think people get scared when they hear the word automation, right?
Yeah.
I have a background in tech. I have a degree in software engineering.
Oh,
So
wow.
that word never scared me. And like one of my goals in life is to make it less scary. Um, and so I'll put it this way: if you automatically pay your electric bill or your mortgage or your rent, you are doing automation,
Right.
right? It's a task that you need to complete that um, you personally are not completing, I guess is maybe a good way to put it. And so for me, automation is using online tools to usually connect to each other, so that I don't have to worry about, let's say, communicating with my guest, right? Calendly will automatically send those emails for me.
Right.
Or scheduling with my guest. Again, like Calendly will do that. But Calendly will also, thanks to an automation tool called Make, formerly Integromat, send that guest's information to Notion so that it becomes part of my podcast planner. So when I review my calendar, I go, okay, I'm interviewing this person this day. It's supposed to come out in a month. Great. I know I'm not going to be scrambling in a month for an episode, right? So that's like the automation side of things. And like we can break that down further. Or I can talk about some really easy automations. And then workflows is just understanding kind of the steps in the process, right? Some people will call these standard operating procedures.
Mm,
And this is basically checklists, right? If you haven't read the checklist manifesto, read that, right? Because this is just going to show you things will be easier if you know what to do and when.
right.
Whereas most people like fly by, oh man, I need to get that intro done. Oh, I need to gather the show notes. Oh, I guess I'll just put this into Chat GPT and ask it to summarize it and just like paste that. Yeah, so let's delve into this podcast interview, right? Like um having the workflows in place or understanding your workflows
Yeah.
will make your life a lot easier.
It's so true. And I find that it's like you don't have to use a lot of thought. It's like, oh, it's Tuesday. I need to do this. It's like, I've done this now. Now my team is going to do this. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
it takes it out of your head. So you're not like, spooling. It's just
Yes.
it's taking care of you. You know what's next. It's when you don't know and you're freaking out like chicken with your head cut off that it's like it all goes to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah, right. My wife would always ask me like, "How do you remember all this stuff?" And I'm like, "I don't."
Mm.
As soon as something comes in my brain and I know it's important, I write it down somewhere else. Right? And so like my podcast planner, when I add a new episode in that Notion page, right, there's the SOP for the interviews. Okay. Um, they already got the link, they already got the Riverside thing. How do you pronounce their name? What's their title? I do a 3 act structure with my interviews. Um, I need to send it off to my editor, right? All of that stuff is written down in a document I know I'm going to be looking at during the interview.
Ooh, that's good.
And that way I can focus on the interview, right? And like make it good instead of going like, okay, after this, I need to make sure to write the summary and the top takeaways. And oh, what did they just say? Can you repeat that? Like
Oh
that's
my God. Yeah,
yeah,
so true.
yeah.
So for someone starting out and they've had their podcast for a little while, they kind of know all the moving parts, but they're like a hot mess. What would you say is like, what would a good first step be to help automate?
The first step, because you can't automate if you don't know what to automate, is write everything down, right? As you do it, or like take 20 minutes and just write down your whole process. And I'm not saying I find a guest, I book a guest, I interview the guest, I edit the podcast, I publish it. No, 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 no. How do you find the guests?
Right.
How do you determine what you're going to talk about on the podcast? Because that takes time.
It
And if
does.
you don't know that part, then again, in a month, you're going to be like, oh, what am I talking about this week? Right. Um, then how do you reach out to the guest? How do you schedule with the guest? Do you send reminders to the guest? Lindsay, I can vouch for the fact that I got lots of reminders from you with crucial information in it, right? So I made sure to read those reminders and check the page that you sent and make sure I had this link ready to go. I felt very prepared, right? Versus, just hoping your guest remembers to hop on the call and is ready to talk about whatever they're going to talk about. Um, so it's do if there's a thing that you need to do, a task that needs to be performed, write it down. Then look at that list and ask yourself, do I need to do these things?
Mm-hmm.
Or can someone else or can something else? Because that's how you get on the road to the Rube Goldberg machine that I have running my podcast, right?
That's awesome. And it's so funny when you go through that exercise and like write out all the moving pieces, you're like, hot dang. Like you almost don't realize it. I just onboarded some new clients, so I changed my processes. But like I feel like over the like couple weeks after that, they'll ask me something. I'm like, dang it, I should have put that in the SOP. And then I had to like add it in. So many little nuances that you just take it for granted or it's in your head that you need to get out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I'll tell you, like I have a podcast blueprint that I use with clients who
Ooh,
are launching new podcasts. And I just rebranded my show. And that blueprint was super helpful
I
for me
bet.
in that regard, right? Because I'm like, new audience, new name, somewhat new mission statement, actually completely new mission statement. I didn't write it down really until this point. Um, and then what I did after that was, okay, so now what do I need to do to rebrand this podcast?
Right.
I talk about podcast workflows all the time, so this is content for me, but it's good to have a document so that, if you start a new podcast or somebody's like, "Hey, what did you have to do?" Oh, well, don't forget to like update all of your social media with the new artwork.
Hmm.
Don't forget to make sure that you can get like the social handle, right? Like I was psyched because I bought the domain, which is so good. And then I was psyched to also find out that social handle was also it's Streamlined FM. And I'm like really stoked about it. It's the only time I've ever bought a .fm. I'm like, fine. It's too good. And it's a really expensive domain, but I'm happy to own it.
The stars aligned for you.
Yes.
And I find that too, like it seems like such an arduous task and it feels overwhelming. But once you do it, it's like short-term pain for long-term gain. It's like imagine a new team member coming in and you do offload some of your tasks. You don't have to be like, oh crap, I gotta write something down. And like it's all
Mm-hmm.
there.
Yeah. When I my alma mater is the University of Scranton, and shortly after I graduated, I got a job there in the IT department. And my onboarding was basically sitting with now this is years ago, maybe things have changed. It was like sitting with coworkers as they kind of like talked through what they're supposed to do. And I was like, do you expect me in this 1 week, 40 hours basically of do you expect me to remember this? And they're like, no, when you have questions, you can come see me. And I'm like, this is a horrible waste of our time then. Like, I don't know what they're paying you, but I know what they're paying me. And we just wasted so much money.
That's
Um,
insane.
yeah. So, um, writing it down or having a process, right? With my VA, I record myself doing everything. And then I have her transcribe the video and write out the steps.
Ooh,
Um,
that's such a hot tip, Joe.
I know. I wish I could say I thought of that, but it was one of my guests on my podcast, Matthew Yays. So
Nice.
good, such good advice. And it was a game changer, right? Like
Yeah.
there have been no mistakes since I started doing that, right?
Ooh.
Because she also knows like if I didn't explain something very well, she's first of all she's seeing it and hearing it, but also she can reference the video and be like, hey, when you did this, where did you get that information? I'll be like, oh right, I forgot to mention it's over
Hmm.
here. Do you have access to that?
Perfect. And then they can tweak it. And to have someone else kind of point out the holes, like
Yes.
how helpful is that?
Yeah, hugely. With that and my editor, he'll be like, "Hey, did you not send an intro this time?" And I'll be like, "Oh, nope, totally forgot. Like I recorded this on like a Friday and I just like
Yeah,
shipped it off and I ran out." And so like having that second set of because like, even with the checklist,
totally.
um, or like that conversation went super long. I usually do the summary and the intro right after. Like I have a task that's like an hour and a half after we record do this. And it just went long and I had to run out to I think like it's called the gal pal dance now, but the daddy daughter dance.
Oh,
Um and so like I wasn't thinking it. I was thinking about the
yeah,
next thing. So
life.
my editor being there I was like, yep, I'm a dum dum. Here you go. Thank
Yeah,
you.
sweet deal. Yeah, good to have those backups just in case.
Yeah.
Now, this is my favorite part. What are your favorite tools?
This is I love this question too. I change tools a lot, but I think I have it dialed in. I feel like I have it dialed in enough that I wrote a blog post about it. Um,
Awesome.
when I'm like reasonably sure I won't have to update soon. And so I'll mention like my top three like personal productivity tools, and then
Mhm.
I'll talk about my favorite podcast tools. Right. So,
Okay.
personal productivity things three for a task manager. Sorry,
What do
that
you
is
call
a
it?
things three. It
Oh,
is it's a Mac and iOS only app. Um,
that's why I haven't
sorry,
heard of it.
sorry. All three of these actually are that. Bear Notes is my favorite notes app. Simple Notes is also really good though. And then Timery, which is a time tracker that sits on top of Toggle.
Mhm.
And the reason I like that is because it has like shortcuts integration with iOS. And so I just kind of like press buttons and timer start, which is the only way that I'm going to keep track of my time.
Mm,
And the reason that's so important is because I need to know how much, it's good to know as a solopreneur, as a podcaster, how much time I'm spending on things. I
yes.
want to spend most of my time on the storytelling aspect of the interview and like if there is editing time in my time tracker at the end of the year, I'll be like, what went wrong here that I didn't
Mm,
send it to my editor, right? Because that took time away from promotion or sponsor outreach or whatever, right? So it's kind of good to audit myself there. And then tools. Um, Hardware, I have the Shure SM7B and the Rodecaster Pro 2. All of their names are ridiculous. Um, and then the Elgato prompter, which allows me to make direct eye contact with you because it's sitting on top of my Sony A6400 camera. That's the hardware. On the software side, I use Riverside to record my interviews. I think it's really good. I When I first started, I would make my guests record their audio locally so that I would combine it later because I was such a stickler for the like pristine audio
Mm,
content. And so like when Riverside came out, I was like, praise be, I don't have to
totally.
talk my guest through how to open up QuickTime or Windows Recorder. Um, so that has been a game changer for me. It's also like pretty good at finding clips. Um,
Oh, I didn't know
Pretty
that.
good. Yeah. I mean, all of these AI things are going to be like, hey, there's probably an interesting thing at the beginning. There's going to be an interesting thing in the middle. Um, so it's like, okay, but you
Yeah.
can adjust, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then I don't edit. When I do edit, I use Logic Pro, and that's usually just to like remove heavy breathing, which I use Isotope RX for.
Hmm.
Um, and Past Magic has been my AI tool of choice.
Yeah, I like it too.
It's really good. I got it on an AppSumo deal. And I personally don't think AI is good at writing. I'm also like kind of like I'm very bullish on that. But what I find it good at is I gave it a custom prompt, which I think is the only tool that allows that right now of like the competition to get the top three takeaways. I say three to
Yes,
six. Um, and it's usually pretty good at finding those
it
based
is.
on the
And
prompt I gave it.
quotes.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like I got my I get my cold opens from that now instead of like trying to remember to mark it down because that's been a game changer, right? That during the interviews I'll have a Google Doc up and I'll take notes.
Oh, wow.
Uh yeah, I used to tell people to do that and I've realized that that's a pretty big I guess a lot of people have a hard time doing that. So it's like a big ask. Um but I'll at least write down like edit points so that I don't have to listen to the entire episode later.
Mm.
Um, I also clap my hands if I know, like if the guest gives me a heads up, um, that they're like, "Hey, can we like rephrase this?"
Oh, yeah.
I'll clap my hands so that my editor can see it. But if it's just like, "Oh, the guest went on a tangent here," or "I went on a tangent here," I'll usually mark down like, "Let's cut out this stuff."
Mm.
Um, and then I'll try to remember like, "Oh, they said this. This could be a cold open." I just let AI figure that out now because they usually again it's in the ballpark
Yeah,
of something good.
I know. I do like Pod Squeeze. I don't know if you tried that one, but that's another good one
Ooh,
with prompts.
no, I haven't. I'll have to check it
Mhm.
out.
For sure. I know tools
Yeah,
are fun. So what do you
yes.
use on the automation workflow side of it? Like, is there like a project management tool that you recommend over others?
Hey, great question. I didn't adjust that at all. Okay, so I currently use Notion. Um, I was using Airtable, and like between you, me, and everybody listening, there are a few things in Airtable that I really, really miss from Notion.
Mm,
Notion overall is more user friendly though. And so Notion is the whole planner, which people will be able to get at podcastworkflows.com/leverage. There'll be like an opt-in there for that.
perfect.
Um, but and that's got the blueprint included actually too. So
Oh, okay. Nice.
um that's the project manager. It's got like statuses and a Kanban board.
A
Um
what board?
so a Kanban, it's like the columns with different
Oh, yeah,
categories.
yeah.
Or Kanban maybe is
I didn't know
also
it had a
another.
name.
Yeah. It's like a Trello board, right?
Yeah.
Like that's yeah. Um and the really nice thing about that is I use make.com, which is formerly Integromat. It's a Zapier competitor.
Oh.
I moved because it was like 90% cheaper
Mm-hmm.
than Zapier. Zapier just changed their prices though, so they're still expensive. Yeah. Where Make is not as expensive. It's like
Nice.
10 bucks a month for me
Oh,
and
that's
I'm
nothing.
like a power user. Yeah. So anything that happens outside of Notion,
Yeah.
Make will update inside of Notion. So someone signs up on Calendly, send the data over to Notion.
Ooh.
Uh, when take my, I make sure to name my folders the episode number, which is also a column in Notion.
Mhm.
This is important. And I should disclaim here for our listeners, I've been podcasting for like 11 years at this point, and my main show is 8 years old now. And so I have built these processes up over time. I didn't build this
Yeah.
yesterday, right? I did one thing and I thought, how can I improve this? That's how we build these systems. And starting with a checklist of everything you do is how to eventually get there. Okay, so I make sure to name my folders in Dropbox the episode number. When I move files into a folder called needs editing, my editor gets an email and the status in Notion is automatically updated to out for edit.
Dang.
My editor knows to name the episode with the episode number as well, so that when he moves it into the production folder, the status is updated to ready for scheduling. My VA gets an email and she knows to schedule it and transcribe the episode, because now she does both for me. So things like that, where I don't have to manage anything. I
Yeah.
just open up the planner in the morning and I'm like, where are episodes at? How many are published, right?
Right.
Because they're ready for publishing is really what I want. Because once an episode's published, I have it watching the RSS feed too. And when an episode is published, it gets marked as published and I don't see it in the upcoming episode's view. Um,
Wow.
yeah. So how many are like scheduled for publish? If it is less than 4, then I know I have a problem. Because I
Mm.
like to be at least a month ahead. And since I'm doing more solo episodes now,
Nice.
I have a little bit more wiggle room to be like, okay, well this week I'm gonna record a solo episode or two.
Yeah. I love that. And yeah, to not have to like manually project manage, message in a task, change the due date, email someone to let them know it's ready for them. Like that probably saves so much time and money to minimize that level of manual communication.
Yeah, it's like I tell people I don't see an episode again after I record the intro, and it's true, because of these systems, right? My VA now, when it's published, I will review because usually my notes for like link in show notes are just like words, and my VA is in the Philippines, and so like
Like,
I
what are you
can't
talking about,
possibly
Joe?
expect her to think to get the link I'm thinking of. Um, so sometimes I'll add, if it's like an affiliate link, I'll make sure to
Mhm.
include that. But
Yeah.
if it's just like random resource, then like I'll double check and make sure.
Oh, for sure.
Um, but yeah, other than that, um, everything else is managed. And you're right? Because without that, I'd have to remember to check my planner
Hmm.
and then say, okay, is 417 back yet? Let me check in the production folder. It is. Let me now mark this. And now my VA, who's in a 12-hour different time zone, will do it tomorrow. Versus if Joel, my editor, sends it at 5 p.m. the previous day, the status gets updated in time for my VA's workday. And so everything just runs a little bit more smoothly now
Yeah.
that we're in like a time zone agnostic world.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah.
Yeah. So much smoother. Now, do you think it's better to have like one person overseeing all the moving pieces, or is it okay when there's different hands in the pot? Or like, how do you recommend who and how many needs to manage the podcast?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it depends on each person. I'm a solopreneur. I've made that choice, right? Because I don't I want a lot of flexibility and I don't want other people's like incomes reliant on me. Um and so no, if we're talking about like what's managing the podcast the most, it's really that Notion document which my VA has access to.
Hmm.
And then everybody just kind of has their own jobs, right? So last year I did have somebody who transcribed, like a separate transcriptionist. Um and so I would move the folder into Dropbox. Then my editor would edit it and send it back. Then my transcriber or transcriptionist would transcribe it and upload the transcript into Dropbox. And then once those pieces were in place, my VA knew to take all of them and put them on the website. And so that's fine by me, where I'll go in and check and make sure things are running smoothly. Um, but if you have a lot of episodes, or you're working with a bunch of people, or you have multiple shows or multiple clients, then it could be good for having like maybe a single point person, or someone to manage the interviews and someone to manage the post-production stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because the person who, like, the post-production work is more technical, and the outreach stuff is more soft skills,
Personal.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Different skill sets.
Um, yeah, and so then it could be good. I like to, at this point, I still like to go out and find the guests. I leverage I had like a VA, a different VA, like doing that for a while. And I just kind of realized that um the personal connection is how I'm going to get the better conversations, right?
Yeah.
I don't want my conversations to be like, who are you?
I
Great.
know,
These are the
right?
5 questions I'm going to ask. Let's do this and then get out of here, right? Like,
Yeah,
yeah. So
totally.
I still like to do that, but
Same
I
here.
do know people who have really good assistants,
Mhm,
who work very closely with them, who do manage the outreach. So I'm not dunking on that. I'm just,
mhm.
that's not where I'm at, right?
No, it's right for you. Absolutely. So, how do you work with clients? Like when someone's like, hey, I'm launching a podcast and I don't know where to begin? Or do you work with people that are like, I've been doing this for a year, I'm a hot mess and I need this to be fixed?
Yeah, so that is the latter is who I really like to work with. Or who I should say, I'm sorry, I like working with everybody, but who I envisioned working with more. Because there are lots of people who will launch and manage podcasts. And I realized that I didn't want to launch like long-term, because I want to be a solopreneur. If I were to launch and run other people's podcasts, there were only a finite amount of those I could do.
Yeah.
And so the way I usually work with people now is, hey, I want to launch a podcast. I have no idea what I'm doing. My value proposition is I will launch with the SOPs and the automations in place
Ooh,
for you to hand off to your team or a different producer.
perfect.
Yeah, it's really good. And like, refer a lot of people to my editor. He loves that. And so that's how I help people launch. It's not just like, I'm going to launch your podcast for you.
Right, right,
It's, let's launch your podcast with the systems and the
right.
automations in place. But then, yeah, most people who come to me, who already have a podcast, are like, hey, you said that you like have 3 kids and also 3 podcasts. Like, how show me, right? And so then we'll enter into like more of a coaching relationship where we'll walk through their process, and
Mhm.
I'll tell them where they can improve. And at like a certain level, like I'll build some of the automations for them. And then we'll optimize their like I do a podcast audit too, where I'm like, okay,
Oh,
so what are you
nice.
doing here? Yeah. So here's your artwork, here's your name. This is the thing that actually made me change the name of my podcast, because I was like doing something and I was like, man, if I was auditing this podcast, I'd be like, why is it named how I built it? Like, and I'm like, so I gotta, not dog food my own product, but like practice what I preach,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
so I was like, it's time. The name doesn't make sense anymore. So but that's like a fun, like low like entry level thing that people can do with me, is hire me
yeah.
to look at their podcast, give them advice on how to grow and how to improve the actual content. Um, and then, because I want people to have good content, we need to find time, right? If
Mhm.
they're spending 4 hours editing,
Ooh,
then they're probably not focusing on the pre-interview or the pre-production stuff, or the packaging afterwards, right? So if I can
yes.
free up 4 hours an episode for them, then they can think about the story a little more, or they can think about, okay, so how am I going to promote this? Who am I going to reach out to? That sort of stuff.
I love that. And from a person that is like, I like it. I see like mess, I just like want to clean it up and tidy and organize. It's like, do you feel like that when you're like, you see the spider web of processes and people and things that they have, and you're like, oh, yay, I get to fix it.
Yeah, and so you know, you got to be a little bit judicious, right? I'm from New York originally, and I'm very direct. Um, and so I can't come out the gate and be like, why are you scheduling with email? Use Calendly, right? Like
Yeah.
that's. But I'll be like, so how much time does it take for you to schedule an interview with a guest, like doing the back and forth and this and that? Um, and then they're like, oh well, it usually takes me like a few emails over a couple of days. And I'll be like, what if you didn't have to worry about that part?
Right.
Like, oh yes, I'm interested. And then I'll just tell them, hey, go sign up for Calendly. Um, oh, well, now that I have Calendly, like, how do I do this thing? Now let's talk. Right now, let's build a
Yeah.
process.
I love that. And so I guess you must train these people as well on like how to use a lot of these tools. Like, okay, you've got a system, but then like how do you implement it, right? So you build out those SOPs with them as well.
Yeah, so that's usually the first thing. I have like a long questionnaire. If they don't want to fill it out themselves, I'll just walk through it with them on a
Yeah.
kickoff call. But it's like, how do you find guests? Or do you have guests, right?
Yeah.
How do you schedule with them? Where do you keep track of everything? So I get a good lay of the land because I think as we were talking about before we started recording, I don't want to be the guy that imposes my tools on somebody else because that's what I'm comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know what tools they're using.
Right.
And I'm confident in my ability to learn those tools faster than they would learn my tools. And so um, usually I look at what they're using and I'm like, okay, how can we connect a few dots here, right? Because
Yeah.
they don't need to build my system to save 10 or 12 hours a week.
Totally.
They can do two things, right? And it'll save them an appreciable amount of time. So
Yeah.
that's my goal is quick wins at their comfort level, because if they're not comfortable, then they're not going to use the system at
No.
all.
So true. I love that. Such good tips. And especially when you are just like ready to pull your hair out, at least like you've given us a few tips of like, okay, here's where you start. Here's the first thing you need to do. Here's one quick win, especially with Calendly on how you can automate something to at least alleviate that piece off your brain.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because if it's easier and less stress, you're going to do a better job at it and you're going to make it work for your business instead of, killing yourself over it.
Yeah. And I'll say this, right? Like Calendly is really the linchpin of a lot of stuff I do pre-production. Because when someone fills out that Calendly link, because it connects with Make or Zapier, or
Mhm.
Pabbly, I think. I'm gonna say that one like quietly because I'm not sure. But it kicks off a bunch of stuff, right? It adds
Yeah,
them to Notion. It creates a Google Doc from a template that I can share with the guest. And so if I'm not having to do all that, it creates tasks in my task manager, to
amazing.
be like, come up with the 3 acts, right? And so like I see that and I'm like, oh right, what story are we going to tell with this guest? How are we going to get there? And then I can send it to them, right? I wouldn't do that if I was like, I need to remind them tomorrow that our episode is 2 days from now, right? Like, or I need to make sure that we're in the like time zone math,
Oh,
just not having to do time zone math,
oh my
right?
God, time zone math is horrible.
Like, is it daylight savings time? Is it
Oh,
what,
sweet
like, is it,
Jesus. I
no
suck
one
at it.
knows, right? And like, I mean, Arizona has like their own way to do, no one knows what time it
They're in the
is in
twilight
November
zone.
in Arizona. Yeah. Like, it's so, but Calendly does, right? Or it can figure it
Yes.
out. So, just that alone, like makes the scheduler worth it.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah.
So good. So how can people find you? I know you've got an awesome resource that our listeners can take away. So I would love for you to share that.
Yeah. So, well, since I talked about a bunch of stuff, I'll make it like a 2 for 1. And
Woo!
you can get like my podcast planning document and my automations library. There will also be like social links in my podcast and the whole nine. You can find that over at podcastworkflows.com/leverage. So yeah, and it'll, yeah, you'll be able to get in touch and get my free resources. And if you have questions about automation and you're like, hey, what you said was too complicated, like what's like 2 levels down from that? I got you. I got you.
Yes, you'll meet them at their level and take
Yeah.
their headaches off their plate.
Yes, exactly.
Love that. So glad we had a chance to meet and talk, and I appreciate you sharing all your great tips to help people not fall into the pit of pod fade.
Yes, my pleasure, Lindsay. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah.
I keep saying Lindsay like lazy. Is it like Lindsay? Like how do you prefer your name is said? I should ask
Just
at the beginning.
Lindsay. Yeah, not
Okay,
Lindsay.
cool. Lindsay, no, yeah, Lindsay is
I
very.
know.
I know. Like I had like a Brandon moment, right? Like if you don't call Brandon, like they'll
I
get
know.
very
Or
mad at you
Megan and
for that.
Megan, or yeah,
Yeah,
bad.
right. Yeah, yeah.
No, you're
So,
good.
all right, excellent.
Awesome. All right. So thanks, folks, for joining us. And we'll see you next week on the Leverage Your Podcast show.